Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the March 2019 Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club podcast. The Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum is dedicated to the promotion, education, and dissemination of pre-hospital research. We believe that it is the responsibility of emergency medical professionals worldwide to build a body of evidence to examine pre-hospital emergency care. Here with the PCRF Journal Club, we take a closer look at some of the latest research happening in EMS. I'm Megan Corey, and I'm joined by Dr. Tony Fernandez, and today we review the article entitled Impact of Shift Duration on Alertness Among Aeromedical Emergency Care Clinician Shift Workers. And this was published in American Journal of Industrial Medicine in 2019. Joining us also is the primary author of this study, Dr. Paul Daniel Patterson. Dr. Patterson is an associate professor of emergency medicine at the University of Pittsburgh, also a nationally registered paramedic. So we welcome Dr. Patterson today and congratulations on this great research. So we'll bring Dr. Patterson in as we go through our design of this very important study. Now, as usual, this study is, or this review is paired with an article written by Dr. Tony Fernandez in EMS World called Journal Watch. And Journal Watch, we encourage listeners to check out this article at emsworld.com, and this is under the category of education and training. Now, thank you all for joining us today. So let's begin. And we want to remind listeners that you can use the chat feature on your screen to type in questions and comments, and we'll bring those into the conversation as we go along here. So, shift fatigue. Most EMS workers know the effects of shift work all too well. In fact, many of you might be feeling them right now. So, deficits in alertness, disruptions in the circadian rhythm, and other neurobehavioral and hormonal changes. We know those have been documented in research. Also, adverse health effects such as cardiovascular disease and disturbances of immune function have been noted. Now, in 2018, the evidence-based guidelines for fatigue risk management in EMS operations recommends shifts of less than 24 hours in durations for EMS. But despite some research in this area, like showing declines in cognitive functioning and some on psychomotor functioning, and this is taken directly from the article, little is known about the impact of shift duration and fatigue on performance-related outcomes in the aeromedical setting. So these researchers then sought to improve the understanding of aeromedical EMS clinician alertness in relation to shift duration. And they wanted to do so by prospectively following clinicians over a 2-week period and testing measures of objective alertness. We'll talk about those tests and how those were measured at the start of a shift and at the end of scheduled shifts, and also stratifying those shifts by lasting 12 or 24 hours, and they ended up looking at them as less than 24 hours or 24 hours. And they hypothesized that the performance on a behavioral test of alertness, something called the PVT, following shifts lasting 24 hours will be worse than alertness following shifts lasting under 24 hours or 12 hours. So that was their hypothesis. This was, again, a prospective observational cohort study design at 4 large aeromedical services located throughout the United States, and we'll put that table up in just a second. And the combined transport volume for these sites was more than 20,000 patients annually. So we'll put that up in just a minute, but I wanted to pull the author in at this point. First of all, welcome, Dr. Patterson. And if you could introduce yourself and a little background of how you got involved in fatigue research.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for highlighting the article and the research that we've just completed. The topic of fatigue, as most people on the call know, or on the webinar know, is very visible in EMS and also in other shift work occupations. It's really a factor that you can't get around. It's going to be present, and we have to figure out ways to manage it. So it's a very important factor for a number of reasons. One, for the health of the clinicians, and also for the safety of the patients who we treat. And my early work in my career was focused on safety, and as fatigue as a threat to safety, hence one of the reasons why I was focused on fatigue. And in particular, while we conducted this study, numerous reasons. One, it was one of the next steps in our different studies that we do on different ground and air medical clinicians. It was one of the next steps we wanted to take. And also because certain regulatory bodies, such as CAIMS, look to clarify their regulations or policies for accreditation, and one of the focus areas happens to be shift work. And so given the importance placed on shift duration from regulatory bodies, professional associations, and in the literature in general, and our noticing a lack of focused research with air medical clinicians and shift durations on different performance outcomes, we decided to embark on this study, and we were fortunate enough to collaborate with multiple organizations across the U.S. to make it happen.
That's great. Is this part of your doctoral research? I noticed that you're a nationally registered paramedic who has a PhD. And was this something that you were interested in at that time, or has this been part of your career?
No, my doctoral focus, my dissertation was actually on medically unnecessary transports. And from there, also, I focused on organizational, operational issues like turnover. It wasn't until a few years after I finished my doctorate that I began to focus on safety and threats to safety. And one of the most important factors that we discovered during my fellowship training on safety was fatigue. And so at that point is when I dove deeply into fatigue and trying to figure out how much of a problem it is, what are some of the causes and consequences. And so it wasn't exactly the focus of my doctoral work now.
And why specifically air medical in this research? Because you haven't exclusively focused on air medical research.
Right, and air medical, a lot of air medical organizations run 24-hour shifts as standard. And as I mentioned before, certain regulatory bodies have some written policies or benchmarks that an organization such as a large air medical organization may need to try to meet in order to be accredited. And there was a lot of questions around what was driving the selection of a particular shift duration in those requirements for accreditation without substantial evidence. And so a lot of times we have these policies, procedures, or regulations or recommendations from national professional associations or regulatory bodies or accreditation bodies. And one of the natural questions that we have is, well, why do they select that? What's the evidence behind that? And when you dig a little deeper, what you discover is oftentimes there's not much evidence behind it, or typically it's indirect evidence that has been cited as a reason for a particular benchmark or goal or objective in an assessment criteria for accreditation. So those are a few of the reasons.
That's a terrific topic in and of itself, right? To just even you could do an entire podcast just on talking about evidence behind certain regulatory requirements, and that actually is something that's kind of coming up for education programs on a separate topic, is changes and what is the evidence behind them. So that's a really interesting note. And CAIMS, I'm assuming, is I'm not completely familiar with, and probably should be, with that acronym for the accrediting body. Is that specifically for air medical?
Yes. The CAIMS stands for the Commission on Accreditation of Medical Transport Systems.
Oh, yeah. Okay, now I recognize it, now that you spell it out. And so they have inside their regulations or inside their standards, in order to be accredited by CAIMS, then you have to have at least policies on shift durations and fatigue, I'm assuming.
Yes, they have certain benchmarks or criteria that they look for when they do an assessment of an organization who wants to be accredited. And one of those focus areas deals with shift work, shift duration, recovery between shifts, and so on.
This is an important point about research, too, to bring up, is that, we have accrediting bodies for a variety of different things, and we know that they're a good thing on one hand for standardization and for everyone doing what we hope to be evidence-based practice. But research can actually also feed into existing regulation or standards by saying, well, we don't really know a whole lot about this one standard, and maybe we should do some more research to feed into it. So it doesn't mean that just because you have a regulation out there or a standard doesn't mean it's backed by solid evidence, and that this is a good example of some research that can actually inform existing standards.
Yes, when you start to dig a little deeper, you find out that, and the reality is, there's not a lot of evidence, and in terms of what is available, the best available evidence, oftentimes it's of very low quality.
Yeah, and from other industry, I think what you mentioned as well. That's
which is
a really
incorrect.
good point. Mm-hmm. So I want to bring up the how you move from a research question to a study design. And Tony, you can jump in at any point in here too. But this is an area that I tend to focus, so that those who are listening out there who might be thinking about research will think about, okay, when I ask a research question, I can actually come up with multiple ways of addressing it. Several ways to design and slice that research question. So you wanted to improve their understanding of EMS clinician alertness in the aeromedical industry in relation to shift duration. So ideally, we know, and we've talked about this on this podcast, that we want to do this prospectively. We don't want to look backwards and ask people something that's not as powerful as looking forward. So how did you choose this, the way that you designed it? 2-week period, the test that you chose, and you chose several of them. First you used this, actigraph, and then you also had these objective, questionnaires, several different questionnaires. How did you decide on how you were going to measure this?
No, that's a really big question. There's a lot of moving parts, as you just kind of described. And a lot of things that need to go into your decision making in terms of what study design you choose. And probably one of the biggest factors that goes into the decision making is resources, availability of resources to pull off the best design possible. And as many of your listeners may know from previous podcasts or webinars, or just from reading the literature, the top of the pile in terms of hierarchy of study designs are randomized controlled trials. Well, we know we couldn't do that. That's hugely resource intensive, almost impossible to pull off in the real world setting, and especially when you're dealing with a topic like shift duration. To have organizations actually change their policies in terms of shift duration at random in a study is going to be almost impossible to do. It's not completely impossible, but very resource intensive. So we knew we couldn't do that.
It might be difficult to go by the IRB as well.
So we knew we couldn't do that. And so when you start to move down the hierarchy of study designs, one of the next designs that you could choose from, depending on which hierarchy you look at, would be a prospective observational type design, where you could follow individuals over time to look at exposure to certain exposures of interest. And in this case, our exposure of interest was shift duration, long duration shifts versus shorter duration shifts. And so we knew that we could pull that off in terms of the duration of number of days or weeks. We know in the literature that it's pretty common when looking at sleep and fatigue issues prospectively that 1 to 2 weeks is pretty popular in terms of a duration, because that allows you to follow people over their natural history of work and sleep and recovery long enough to capture enough data, such as them working 1 or 2 shifts rather than just one shift, that might be more real world data in terms of it's a better look at what goes on out in the field than, for example, following someone over just the course of one shift. If I followed these individuals over the course of one shift, that may not be exactly one representative of the real world experience with alertness. So given those, given the information that we gleaned from the literature about 1 to 2 weeks, we chose 2 weeks. And we knew that a lot of the aeromedical clinicians don't work back-to-back shifts, because a lot of the clinicians work 24 hours or they do a 24, then a 12, or a 24, and that takes, a few days to accomplish. And so we had enough resources available to do it for 2 weeks versus 1 week versus, a less time.
I think you bring up something really important too, is and when we teach research to our paramedic students, one of the surprises that they have is really how much they need to go back and learn about the background of existing research, and through a good comprehensive literature search, and also through reading and interacting with other studies. And that I think, it's hard enough to come up with a research question, but your research question evolves as you look at the literature, especially if you're just starting out in research. I think they undervalue the importance of looking at other studies and reading not just the background, but also well-designed studies that you should, can use and say, okay, well, it looks like this would be a good way of measuring, just like you were citing, 1 to 2 weeks seems like from other existing research, a good target time period at least.
Yeah, there's no I guess I would say gold standard approach that you can lean on when you're making these decisions. Oftentimes, as you just described, you have to have a command, and I want to put this in big bold quotations, all caps, to emphasize this. You have to have a real command of the literature to really confidently propose a study that is going to have an impact on the science, on the questions that you ask, on the policies and procedures that are existing out there. If you don't have a full command of that literature, you risk conducting a study that may have already been done. And it's okay to have multiple studies testing the same question, because that helps us in terms of a body of evidence. But you may be making the same mistakes that have already been made, and the reality is that is potentially a waste of resources. And what are you really adding? So I'd say to most of the listeners who are aspiring researchers, one of the things you should do for early in your career is learn how to do systematic reviews, so that when you are asked, why did you choose that research question, or why did you choose that design, you can say pretty confidently and with strong confidence that the literature on this particular topic inside and out, and where the limitations are and what has and has not been done. So it is extremely important that prior to embarking on a primary data collection study, such as the one that we did, that you feel really, really confident that what has and has not been done, and how it has been done in the past, and what the mistakes were.
I would say especially in a study like this, because you're pulling from other industry. So it's not just the healthcare workforce that studied fatigue and shift work, and the effects of a lack of sleep on performance. It's aeromedical, as you mentioned in their discussion section. So that's even more so. Don't discount that you might have to actually look into other industry if it's related to what your research question and hypothesis are. So let's walk through then how you recruited. So it looks like you had, it's a cohort study design, which means you're following groups over time, right? 4 aeromedical services. And I'm going to move the table to show the demographic characteristics of these aeromedical services. So you had 4 sites. And was this mostly by convenience you had access, or how did you decide on these sites?
Well, ideally we would begin with an all-encompassing list of potentially eligible organizations, and we could recruit from that list. Well, that doesn't often happen.
Yeah.
As much as we would like to begin with that, it just doesn't happen. So what we knew was that we knew there were certain organizations out there who we could approach who might be interested in participating. And we knew that we had enough resources to make it happen for 3 to 4 organizations. So just to make it barely multi-site. It wasn't, on the upper end of multi-site, meaning, dozens of organizations, but we had just enough resources to make it multi-site and be able to go after 4 organizations. And so we approached several organizations. and all of them that we approached initially agreed. And a reason we approached those organizations in those locations was many of our co-investigators were located in the metro areas proximal to these organizations, and they had a relationship with the chiefs or directors or CEOs of these organizations. And so we knew that we could use those connections to help us with recruitment. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes that's how a lot of data collection is done in EMS, where you have a relationship with an organization, or you're actually employed in an organization, and you're able to, through those connections, create a solid relationship for research purposes. And that's how we began with our recruitment. And luckily, we had enough representation across most of the census regions. We just didn't have any out west.
Yeah, so we have Midwest, Northeast, and Southern. But you have a significant number of clinicians that are eligible at each site. And the inclusion, it looks like, was 18 years and older, worked clinically at one of the 4 agencies. Anybody work for more than one of these agencies?
No, they did not cross-pollinate in these agencies because there was so much distance between them.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were really far apart. So there was not cross-pollination of clinicians, but a lot of the clinicians who participated worked at more than one, had more than one employer.
Yeah, I saw that. Almost half of them did. I thought that was pretty significant in that one.
That's not uncommon in EMS. Most of the studies that we do, between 35 and 45% have more than one employer. And there's one study that we know that was done in air medicine some number of years ago, where over 80% of the clinicians had more than one job. So multi-employer clinicians is not uncommon in EMS.
Yeah. And then they consented, 12 or 24-hour shifts. And I noticed you later on, you noticed that, or you note that 12-hour shifts were that category was turned into less than 24 because of shift holdovers and the like. And then they consented, which means they had to go through an informed consent process. You had to explain the risks and benefits and opt-out methods and other things like that, and get IRB approval from all 4 sites. So there were 4 different IRBs to go through. Correct. So that's an important thing for people to know out there too, is if you're going to do a study like this, in particular, you have active participants who are recruited and they're stepping up to volunteer to be subjects in this study. There's a procedure for informed consent, for signing an informed consent, for letting them know the risks and benefits, if there are any, and then the opt-out procedures, and then running that through the IRB.
And this is Tony Fernandez. I just wanted to say to Dr. Patterson, thanks again for this great study. And if you could speak a little bit to our listeners about working with four IRBs, that in and of itself is quite a task. And if you can give our listeners kind of an idea of how you navigated those waters.
So that's a good question, and thanks for that, because it is logistically one of the more bothersome parts of doing research. And IRBs are constantly changing in terms of how much rigor or requirements they have of the investigators who submit applications for approval, in terms of what's expedited versus full board review based off of the risk assessments. And as you can imagine, dealing with 4 different ones, there's a little bit of a different culture at all these 4 different IRBs, and so their procedures differ. They're not similar. So the key here is that you have a strong network of co-investigators, and at each site you have a lead site investigator who can help shepherd the application through in a timely way. And I can tell you, when we would have our bi-weekly conference calls just to kind of gear up for the data collection, when other site investigators would hear the progress of one site, you could feel the peer pressure there building, that some of the other sites who might have been behind in getting their paperwork through were pushing following the end of the conference call to get their paperwork through so they could be on the same time frame as everybody. So the key here is that you have really strong site investigators, co-investigators for the whole team, who can help shepherd this kind of stuff through. And a lot of times that work goes unpaid. Doing this kind of work hopefully is funded, but oftentimes, even if it's funded, a lot of that time you spend on some of this paperwork that's necessary to get the study off the ground goes unpaid and is very much volunteer. And obviously, they have to have a strong understanding of the processes and protocols required of the local IRB.
I thought it was really impressive that you got the actual number of eligible participants. I mean, that I think is a statement to how clear you communicate with the potential participants. I really think that's the main factor, is how well, as a study coordinator, if anybody out there becomes even a study coordinator, a member of a team, which is a lot of fun and really interesting, communication becomes the primary tool that you have, so that when the participants in particular have questions, especially if it runs maybe a little bit of the border of, if there's any ethical questions about measures or anything like that, it's really important to be there for the participants to answer any questions, so that you can encourage them to continue on. It also helps to feed back to the investigators as well. So
yeah, we had a lot of site coordinators as well,
yeah,
who are not co-authors, who did a lot of logistical dirty work in terms of communicating with the team, managing the equipment, going out to the study sites to collect data, to do consenting. So it was logistically very challenging to make that happen. So, hats off to all the research coordinators who did a lot of logistical dirty work to help make this happen. And it's a challenging thing. Yeah.
That's great. So let's talk about, and I know Tony's probably going to have some questions here, or maybe some comments about how you then want to measure fatigue. So we have on the screen right now is just the breakdown of what ended up being your participants at each site. But there's I'd like to go through your measures. So this is a real tricky part. It's like, okay, I want to measure the difference in these this level of alertness or a behavioral test between these two groups, these two cohorts of ones that work less than 24 hours, ones that work 24 hours. But there's two things. One is I want to measure, how do I measure level of alertness? And then the other is what kind of things, and we always say this to our, again, budding researchers out there, what kind of things might affect the outcome? What are the confounding variables that we want to also measure, so that we can make sure that each group is distributed equally? So let's first talk about how you wanted to measure the outcome and how you came up with these measures.
Sure. The outcome of interest was alertness or / performance, and those are used interchangeably when talking about psychomotor vigilance. So alertness is impacted by a number of factors, and probably one of the biggest factors is sleep or sleep deprivation, and fatigue, obviously, which is related to that. So we know from the sleep science literature that psychomotor vigilance testing is an established, well-established measure of performance / alertness. So we knew we wanted to use that test. There are others out there. You could use a lot of cognitive testing, such as number recall, and there's just a wide variety of different tests out there to look at different aspects of cognition. But the one that's most commonly used and well established out there in the literature, used in a wide variety of settings, is psychomotor vigilance. And what that is, it's an assessment of reaction time over a period of time, such as 10 minutes, 5 minutes, or 3 minutes. The original test, developed by Dr. Denisse and colleagues out of University of Pennsylvania, was the 10-minute version, and it was performed initially on a computer where there was a screen. Sometimes a dot would show up. More recently, it's been a little red box with green numbers counting down in milliseconds. And as soon as it starts to count down, years ago when people used the 10-minute version primarily, they would just hit the space bar or some key on the keyboard to stop it. And those numbers would appear at random times in that box. And you just had to be vigilant to keep your eye on the box and stop the numbers from counting down. And that was basically your reaction time. So, which is also, again, how people assess alertness or / performance. It evolved over time that, and with additional testing, that a 5-minute version was possible, and it was reliable and valid. And then more recently, they came out with a 3-minute version, which, as you can imagine, makes a lot of field research more feasible. Having an EMS clinician sit for 10 minutes and do a psychomotor a reaction time test is almost a no-go.
Yeah.
So we knew that we could not do feasibly the 10-minute version, and we were really on the bubble about the 5-minute version. But we felt pretty confident that we could pull it off with the 3-minute version, because you got to imagine when you're trying to recruit people to participate in the study voluntarily, describing to them what is involved in the study, and if you come out and say, I need you to sit still for 10 minutes and watch this screen, we would probably not be able to recruit the numbers that we did in this study. But if I say, hey, it's a really quick 3-minute assessment, it only takes you 3 minutes, people are more likely to participate. So a couple of the reasons we decided on the PVT 3-minute version is based off of fear of not being able to recruit enough participants given the duration of the time required to be involved in the study. And also the reliability and validity data that supports that tool was positive. And also it's a standard, it's a well-established tool out there in the sleep world.
I saw that one of the statements that stood out to me when you were writing about the PVT test being an evaluation of simple reaction time and the ability of the participant to sustain attention. That stood out to me, that was the definition of it. But it also is resistant to practice effects. So I thought that was an important feature. And in particular, I would say the 3-minute version is probably resistant to practice.
Yeah, that has been a potential criticism or limitation of the tool that has been addressed. Which, thank goodness, because if you have a tool that has practice effects, then that may require you to administer it multiple times and take maybe the average of all those assessments together, which would require more time of the participant, which may in the end cause that individual to drop out of the study because they just don't like the processes that you are requiring them to do. So, thank goodness the version that we used is supported by some good data.
And I thought that it was really interesting that in relation to your outcome, you got some really good demographic baseline data for the participants' level of sleepiness and fatigue. You used a lot of different scales to collect that information. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that and kind of how this population relates to the rest in terms of sleepiness and the like.
Oh yeah, so typically when you do a study, whether it's a prospective design like this one or a cross-sectional design, you would typically administer a survey at baseline when they first enroll, because you want to be able to describe the population of people who are participating in your study. And pretty standard, you have some baseline demographics like age, sex, race, etc., experience as a clinician, what your certification level is, etc. On top of that, there are certain other characteristics we would like to report, which will give people who read the study some perspective on what these individuals look like in relation to other populations. And some of the common measures that you need to capture when dealing with sleep and fatigue issues are some of the ones that we captured, such as the Epworth Sleepiness Scale, the Chandler Fatigue Questionnaire, which is one of many different fatigue questionnaires out there, the OFER, the Occupational Fatigue Exhaustion Recovery Tool, which is a proprietary tool, that has several different components that help assess fatigue, chronic fatigue, inter-shift recovery, acute fatigue. The PSQI, Dr. Buysse, who invented the PSQI, is one of our co-investigators. He's here at University of Pittsburgh, a really well-established, well-known sleep scientist. His PSQI tool has been used, I can't tell you how many thousands of times in many different countries, and has become a standard for measuring sleep quality. And there are a number of other tools out there or demographics that we capture, like general health status.
So those were to achieve baseline, right? Those, the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, the ESS, and several others they offer, those are all to just done at baseline, correct?
Correct. And there was no real reason for us to collect them at the end of the 14 days because our focus was not whether or not one of those factors changed over time. Our focus was what was the impact of the shift duration, our exposure of interest, on alertness / performance as measured by the PVT. So really the main reason we captured the demographic data at baseline was to be able to adequately describe our population.
Yeah. And then, so you had the PVT test, but you also had a secondary outcome as well, right? You had the secondary outcome of inter-shift recovery, daily shift work, sleep hours, and subjective sleep quality, and that was achieved through a daily diary.
Yes. So a lot of times when you're selecting on secondary outcomes of interest, there may be some interest from the investigators. There may be some provocative research out there in other areas or within your domain of interest, or just may be a question of interest from the investigators. And one of the ones that I was really interested in was inter-shift recovery, which stems from a previous study that we did and published on, which was recovery between shifts that was published in Pre-Hospital Emergency Care. There is no standard for how you measure recovery between shifts. Just like with fatigue, most of that is captured with self-report. We could do some more objective measures, such as like heart rate variability and how it may recover post exposure to shift work. We could look at blood pressure recovery. We could look at other indicators, but we were interested in self-report because it was easy to capture. There appeared to be no standard for how you captured it. So we identified it as a secondary outcome of interest because we were just mainly interested in to see how recovery was impacted by exposure to shift work.
You know, before we get into the results here, I have a question about that. Is there anything that suggests a recommended recovery, or you know, are we looking for research to inform that? That might go back to what you said at the very beginning, which is, you know, we can't avoid this kind of shift work. This is sort of part of the industry. So then maybe there's something we can do to inform recommendations about recovery.
No, that's an important question. Right now, there really is no, like I said, no standard, no gold standard way to assess that. Usually it's through self-report. A lot of the, I can, send you that paper that we published before, but there are some industries that establish a set number of hours of recovery between shifts. And that has been largely based off of the belief that if you have a minimum of 8 to 16 hours off, you can get a full 7 to 8 hours rest or sleep between shifts, which we all know is kind of not reality. But a lot of that is not based off of good science or a deep literature. There's really not a deep literature on that. So right now, currently, I'm leading a study where we're collecting 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure measurements over the course of a workday and non-workday, so that we can get some sense of how long it might take for your blood pressure patterns to recover after exposure to night shifts. So I believe that recovery, eventually, the literature on that will probably be based off of parameters from your cardiovascular health, your metabolic health, not just off of your self-report, which currently is mainly what it's based off of.
Okay. So let's dive into the results here. Unless, Tony, you have any other questions about the design and methods?
No, I think we covered them. I think let's get to the results. They're really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So why don't you start by, and I'm going to leave this slide up here just to kind of whittle down, what we're talking about here in terms of unique individuals and those who participated twice and what that looked like. So if you could just give us kind of the breakdown of, at the end, what did your participants look like?
Well, from table 2, you can see the demographics of the participants from table 2. You can see their average age. You can see the distribution of their certification level. About half of them were pre-hospital nurses, and approximately a third were paramedics, and around 10% were respiratory therapists, because one of the sites used the configuration of a pre-hospital nurse and respiratory therapist type crew model. In terms of dual employment, approximately 45 to 50% worked more than one job. On average, years of experience, around 20 years experience, which is kind of what you would want to see for air medical clinicians, was a lot of experience, because there is a higher level of training there. And about a third regularly worked less than 24-hour shift durations, and about 2/3 worked 24-hour shifts. And then the rest of the demographics are presented in table 2, but they looked as we expected in terms of who participated.
Now, can you explain, when we see 112 unique individuals, 138 total participations, the differences in numbers? Because I know sometimes that's confusing to students who are first reading research. And when you see this breakdown of, eligible individuals, unique individuals, withdrawals, how do you, how do you know which population to study, and what are we talking about here?
That's a good question. So we knew that from our power calculation, so we knew that we hypothesized that the performance on the PVT would be worse for those who did a 24-hour shift versus those who did 12. That was our hypothesis. And based off of some data that we could pull from the literature, we did a power calculation. And that informed us, before we even collected our first piece of data, how many individuals we needed to recruit and enroll in the study in order to confidently test our hypothesis. And that was around, I think it was around 126 or so that we knew we had to enroll over the course of the study to achieve adequate power to feel confident about testing our hypothesis. And so with that in mind, we knew that we knew that going into the study that we did not have a giant pool of potential enrollees. We only had 286 to almost 300 total potential. And we knew that the ones who would be interested in participating would probably be less than half of that, around 50%, who would want to actually voluntarily participate. So going into the study with that knowledge, we knew that it would be really difficult for us to achieve our goal sample size. So the statistician said to us in this conversation early in the design of the study, it's okay if someone participates twice, but no more than twice. And the reason is, if they participated more than twice, you wouldn't really get any new data, any good new data. But with a minimum of 2 participations, you would achieve adequate sample size of exposure and outcome of interest to test the hypothesis and not risk getting any useless data. Now, I'm not a statistician. I married one. And she tells me all the time that I'm not a card-carrying statistician, so I believe everything she says. And what she was actually our statistician on this study. She powered the study to only allow for twice participations, and that is a unique feature of this study, and that you don't see in a lot of prospective studies where people are allowed to participate more than once. So we stratified the presentation of the data so that you could get some sense of whether or not the people that participated twice looked any different from those who participated just once.
Yeah. So by twice, did they go 4 weeks then? They went 2 weeks
Correct.
and then 2 weeks? Okay.
Correct. They participated 2 weeks, and then they waited, I think on average, 90 days. I think there was a long lag period between their second participation. So it wasn't back-to-back.
Okay. And the only time we see, I guess, well, it would be different if it's a crossover design when you go from one group to another. So a crossover would be like if you worked on 12s and then you crossed over into the 24-hour shift. So we didn't have any of those. They stayed on their individual shift type, correct?
Right. Yeah, we did not force individuals to work one shift duration first versus the other. That logistically is another challenge when trying to do primary data collection, is requiring people to do certain things. So we just let them naturally work whatever shift schedule they worked. Okay.
So let's talk about the main results then. And I don't have every table on the slides, but if you have the paper, you can look at, I think the first one would be table 3. If you can walk us through the results, what kind of things you found.
Okay, so table 3.
This is the sleep, wake, and shift work activity during the 2-week study period.
Right, okay, so you can see that over the course of the 2 weeks, the average number of shifts worked per person was 4, and that, is actually what we expected. We didn't expect people to work a lot of shifts, given that a lot of them work 24-hour shifts, or we're on a 12-hour rotation, 12 hours on, 12 hours off, or maybe 12 hours on, 24 hours, or 36 hours off. And another key feature here is that, a lot of the folks in this study worked multiple jobs. We did not collect data from them when they worked their other job. A lot of folks only reported data or only participated in the PVT assessments when they were at their primary job for this study.
But they wore the little wrist thing, the little...
They wore the actigraph. Yes. So we got their sleep activity. Yes. Yeah. Okay. In terms of shift duration, you can see that for the shifts that were classified as less than 24 hours, the averages went around 11 to 12 hours, and the one that was 24 hours was right around 24 hours. Hours of sleep before shift, which was really kind of surprising to us, because in our previous research we found that, which is populated mostly with ground personnel, in this population you see that the average sleep hours was a little more than 7 hours before their shift. And then in the sleep after the shift was a little bit less. And then a lot of these organizations, actually all of them but one organization allowed their crews to nap on duty. One of them did not. And you can see the hours of sleep that people got during the shift. And as you might expect, there was more sleep on shift, on duty, during the 24-hour shifts than there was on the 12, as you might expect.
And it was almost proportionately the same, right? It was like 2.5 hours or 3 hours or something on the 12s and twice that on the 24s. So it was almost proportionately the same.
Yeah. I guess if you could see it that way. And in terms of inter-shift recovery, we didn't see any difference. Most people felt on this it was a single item measure of recovery, which again, there's no standard measure out there. I'm not even sure that we were able to measure it as accurately as I wanted to, but we did not see a difference between those who worked less than 24s versus those who worked 24s in terms of inter-shift recovery.
Tony, do you have any items on these on that table? Any questions or comments on that table that would be important for our listeners?
Yeah, I think we covered that pretty well. I think it's time for the main hypothesis was that performance on behavioral tests of alertness following shifts less than 24 hours would be worse than alertness following shifts less than 12 hours. And Dr. Patterson, can you tell us if you accepted or rejected that hypothesis?
Well, if you, as you alluded to, hopefully folks have a copy of the article or maybe have at least browsed the abstract. We did not find a difference. And if you actually are able to scroll to figure 2, I'm going to explain why.
Yeah, and figure 2 is the bar chart. I have table 4 up on the screen, but if people have the article in figure 2, you have the timing of PVT assessments.
Right. So if you're able to show that, this actually helps to explain why we didn't see a difference. So we haven't actually discussed yet when we measured the PVT. So we measured the PVT at the start of the shift and again at the end of the shift. Okay. So if you've ever worked a 24-hour shift, you might recognize that in most places, those shifts start and end at around 0600, 0700, or 0800 hours. And that's what we've had in our experience with this study. The vast majority of those shifts started and ended at 0600, 0700, or 0800 hours. And you can see that from the figure that quantifies when we captured the start of shift PVT and the end of shift PVT. It kind of displays that very clearly. If you know anything about sleep, circadian rhythms, and I'll give a quick primer here. We are diurnal species. We like to be alert and awake during daylight hours and asleep during nighttime hours. And there are many different biological indicators that confirm that. One are hormones. Melatonin goes up in the late evening hours and stays elevated. Cortisol goes down in the late evening hours and stays depressed until early morning hours. Our body temperature is peaked around 5 p.m., 1700 hours approximately, and is at its lowest point about 1 degree Celsius lower than our peak around 0300, 0400, 0500 hours in the morning. And with that drop in body temperature, we have a really low level of alertness and this huge pressure to sleep. And those hormones and that body temperature starts to change around 0600, 0700, 0800 hours, where cortisol goes back up, your body temperature goes back up, melatonin goes down, and thus your alertness increases. So with that in mind, you might already have deduced why we found no difference in the PVT captured at the beginning and end of shift. Our alertness starts to elevate after a night of sleep in those early morning hours. If we would have captured PVTs at different points during the time of the shift, we may have seen some differences in terms of performance, but we feasibly and logistically could not do that. It would be way too expensive and very logistically challenging to capture PVTs over the course of the shift multiple times. So based off of the resources that we had, we only captured it at the beginning and at the end. And when you look at the data and that stratification of just comparing PVTs at the start and at the end, stratified by shift duration, we didn't see a difference. And I'm hoping that that really brief primer to sleep physiology kind of helps to potentially explain why.
Sure, and I think you did a really good job in the discussion too. And you mentioned also under future studies should incorporate more frequent assessments of PVT. It's kind of difficult, but then you notice that, or you note that deficits in performance among EMS clinicians are thought to occur during that midpoint, which is the midnight to 5 a.m. time. So you also had there is a nice review for those listening on that page that has, it's page 8, that has that chart that we're talking about, as well as table 4, which we're looking at on the screen, has a description of these of the circadian rhythm and the associated rises in body temperature and cortisol and drop in melatonin and those kind of things as you wake up. So it's a nice description of that. I thought that was a real strength of the paper.
Yeah, but one thing I want to point out is that when we actually looked a little deeper in terms of the PVTs, and there are multiple measures you can look at from a PVT. You can look at the mean reaction time, you can look at the lapses in concentration, the false starts, and you can also look at speed, which is the inverse of the reaction time. Those are 4 common measures reported, which are reported in our paper. And we found that when looking at the 12-hour shifts in particular, looking at day versus night shifts, there was a little bit of a difference there in a few of those measures. We found that there were some deficits in the folks who, in their end of shift PVT, and they're started as well, for those who work the night shift versus those who work the day shift. And we also found that if someone was awoken from their nap proximal to their end of shift PVT assessment, their performance suffered a little bit on the PVT, and we attribute that to sleep inertia. I'm not sure how familiar the listeners are with the topic of sleep inertia. It's that groggy feeling you feel when you initially wake up, and it can be overwhelmingly debilitating if you wake up from a deep sleep. And in fact, the literature out there suggests even after a full 8 hours of sleep, we are only about 65% as productive as our peak alertness within the first 3 to 4 minutes of waking up. So you can imagine when we are awoken by the tones, the alarm from a deep sleep while on duty, trying to perform within those first few minutes is quite difficult. I can tell you from my own personal experience. I'm not afraid to admit it. When I've been woken up from a nap while on duty, and I know that I was in a deep stage sleep, it was quite difficult for the first few minutes to be prepared to drive an ambulance. And it oftentimes led to a delay in the shoot time of getting out of the bay, which is probably helpful that that happened, because you don't want to be on the road when you're overwhelmingly groggy. So those are some of the interesting findings that we had. Even though we didn't find a difference when stratified by shift duration alone, we did see some unique findings when looking at day versus night, and how proximal the PVT was to when they woke from their nap.
Yeah. And speaking of sleep inertia, Dr. Bill Toon has just joined us. Welcome, Dr. Toon. We're deep in the heart of this study here, but I'm wondering if you have any comments or questions for the author here on this important study on fatigue.
No, but I love the study, and this time zone thing still I haven't gotten straightened out. So one day I will. I expect you to be keeping me on time, Megan. So
yes.
My one thing I would, I personally have experienced, as I'm sure every provider has, that grogginess, the tiredness. Does the number is how busy the person on the shift have an impact that was or wasn't measured? And I'm sorry if I missed that when I read through it, because to me it would seem that someone who has a very active shift, would have a different fatigue level during the shift, and their performance would change.
That's a good question, and we did not report that in this study. We did measure how much they encountered in terms of patient contacts, but we do not have that reported in this study. And I don't. I'm trying to recall what that data looked like, and I think it was a very moderate number of patients on average. I don't think that we saw a dramatically busy set of data from folks. So I'm trying to recall accurately, and I apologize that we don't have that in there.
Yeah, that's
I'm just saying, do you think that's the difference between a busy urban ground service versus flight services? My limited experience in flight services, and with the one service I worked for, there was plenty of shifts that went by where we did absolutely nothing for 24 hours, and there was occasionally a 6-flight shift, that took place. And I can tell you, the 6-flight days I was really bad, but I also felt pretty lousy on the no-flight days.
Oh, I agree with you. And my experience in doing primary data collection from air medical cert and ground is that the folks who end their shift having run a lot of calls, whether it be air or ground, are physically and mentally fatigued. And the ones who have done nothing, because I can tell you, I'm collecting data now for a blood pressure study, and I've actually gone out to the bases and collected data where folks, I had to wake them up because they didn't have a call all shift, and had them do PVTs, and their performance was really bad because they've been lounging around all night or all day. So workload is a factor. I don't think we really know what the role is yet, especially in EMS, because our typical way to measure workload is by call volume or dispatches or transport.